In Matthew 1 verses 22 to 23 we read this. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet, that the Virgin Mary will be with child, will give birth to a son, and they will call him Immanuel, which means God with us. Merry Christmas everyone. We're here today to celebrate the fulfilment of that prophecy. We're here to celebrate Immanuel, the day that a distant, aloof and somewhat terrifying God came near to us. A day when our Creator stepped into his creation in the most unbelievable way. A day when God himself stepped out of eternity into time, out of the infinite glory of heaven into the finite world of mankind. A day when the omnipotent Creator became one of creation's most helpless creatures, a tiny, dependent, newborn baby. I could preach to you about the incarnation and the sin of man and the need for God to become one of us, to redeem us for our sin. I could tell you about his journey from the cradle to the cross and how he lived a perfect life and died a final death on our behalf, and how our faith in his life, death and resurrection will allow us to receive the gift of eternal life. In fact, I could preach a dozen different sermons on this Christmas day, and I have over the years. But I find myself captured by the word Immanuel today. God with us. What does that really mean? I find myself contemplating the reason why God would do what he did in that stable in Bethlehem all those years ago. The theologians will tell us our need for salvation and how Jesus had to be a man to redeem us. But I want us to look through the theological mumbo-jumbo today and see the heart of a God who desired to come near to his children. Immanuel, God came near. Immanuel, God became intimate. Immanuel, God got personal and entered our very humanity so that he would feel what we feel, live what we live, know the same limitations and the same temptations every human experiences. He was not content to be a distant deity, removed from our real day-to-day existence. Not like Bette Midler's hit song, which said that God was watching us from a distance. No, not our God. He came as close as you could ever imagine. He stepped right into our human world. And then not even as an adult. He could have just turned up in the Jordan one day, been baptized and started his ministry. No, our God wanted the whole human experience from conception to grave. Friends, let me encourage you today to contemplate Immanuel. Let me encourage you to see that in the midst of the saving, redeeming, wrath-appeasing ministry of Jesus Christ, when he was here, there is an even deeper message, an even deeper reality wrapped up in the Christmas message. And that Immanuel, God, is with us. His human experiences allow him to relate to us at our deepest point of need. The Christmas story is about God who is near, a God who is here, a God who is real, a God who understands everything you feel and everything you ache for inside. So I want to share a true story with you this morning that touched my heart when I first heard it some years ago. And it gave me a vivid picture of what Immanuel looks like. All the theological mumbo-jumbo that's wrapped around that wonderful word, all of which is important in a different context, it all unravelled and just became a real experience with real human beings from a God who is near. This story comes from a missionary pastor's wife. I remember a day one winter that stands out like a boulder in my life. The weather was unusually cold. Our salary had not been regularly paid and did not meet our needs even when it was. My husband was away much of the time, travelling from one district to another. Our boys were well, but my little Ruth was quite sick, and none of us were decently clothed. I patched and I repatched with spirit sinking to the lowest ebb. The water gave out in the well and the wind blew through the cracks in the floor. The people in our local parish were really kind. They were generous too, but the settlement was new and each family was struggling for themselves. Little by little, at the time I needed it most, my faith began to waver. Early in life I was taught to take God at His word, and I thought my lesson was well learned. I had leaned upon the promises of God in dark times and until I knew, as David knew, that God was my fortress and my deliverer. Now a daily prayer for forgiveness was all I could muster. My husband's coat was hardly thick enough for spring, much less winter. He was even obliged to ride miles to attend some meeting or funeral. Never warm enough. Many times our breakfast was just cornbread and a cup of tea without any sugar. Christmas was almost here. The children always expected their presents. I remember the ice was thick and smooth and the boys were longing for a pair of ice skates. Ruth, in some unaccountable way, had taken a fancy that the dolls I had made were no longer suitable. She wanted a nice large doll and insisted on praying for it every night. I knew it seemed impossible, but I wanted so much to give each child their presents. It seemed as if God had deserted us. But I didn't tell my husband all of this. I just carried it in my heart. He worked so earnestly and so heartily. I supposed him to be as hopeful as ever. I kept the lounge room cheerful with an open fire, and I tried to serve our scanty meals as invitingly as I could. The morning before Christmas, James was called to see a sick man. I put a piece of bread in for his lunch. It was the best I could do. I wrapped my plaid shawl around his neck and then tried to whisper a promise, as I often had, but the words died away on my lips. I let him go without it. That was a dark, hopeless day I will never forget. I coaxed the children to bed early, for I could not bear their chatter. When Ruth went to bed, I listened to her prayers as usual. She asked for the last time for this wonderful, wonderful doll that she'd been dreaming about, and for the skates for her brothers. Her bright face looked so alive when she whispered to me, "You know, I think they'll be here in the morning, Mummy." I went to the lounge room and sat down alone and gave way to the bitterest of tears. Before long, James returned, freezing cold and exhausted. He pulled off his boots, the thin socks slipped off with them, and his feet were just blue with cold. "I wouldn't treat a dog that way, let alone a faithful servant," I said. Then, as I glanced up and saw the lines of his face and the look of despair, it flashed across my mind. The worst had happened. James had let go too. I bought him a cup of tea, feeling sick and dizzy at the very thought that he'd given up hope. He took my hand and we sat for an hour without saying a single word. I just wanted to die and meet God and tell him his promises were not true. My soul was so full of rebellious despair. Suddenly there came a sound of bells, a quick stop and a loud knock on the door. James sprang up to open it, and there stood Deacon White. He said, "A box came by express just before dark. I thought I'd bring it around as soon as I could get away. Reckon it might be for Christmas. At any rate, I said that thou shalt have it tonight. Here is a turkey my wife asked me to fetch along for you as well, and these other things I believe belong to you." There was a basket of potatoes, a bag of flour. Talking all the time, he hurried in the box, and then, with a hearty good night, he rode away. Still without speaking, James found a chisel and opened the wooden box. He drew out first a red blanket, and then he saw that beneath it the box was full of clothing. It seemed at that moment as if Christ fastened upon me a look of reproach. James sat down and covered his face with his hands. "I can't touch them," he said. "I haven't been true. Just when God was trying me to see if I could hold out, I didn't. Do you think I could not see how you were suffering? I had no word of comfort to offer. I now know how to preach the awfulness of turning away from God." "James," I said, clinging to him, "don't take it to heart like this. I am to blame. I ought to have helped you. We will ask God together to forgive us." "Wait a moment, dear, I just can't talk now," he said. Then he went into another room and knelt down, and my heart broke. In an instant all the darkness, all the stubbornness rolled away. Jesus came again and stood before me. With the loving word, "daughter," came sweet promises of tenderness and joy of soul. I was so lost in praise and gratitude I forgot anything else. I don't know how long I was there before James came back. He too had found peace. "Now, my dear wife," he said, "let us thank God together." Poured out words of praise, Bible words, for nothing else could express our thanksgiving. It was 11 o'clock, the fire was low, and there was this great box, and nothing touched but the warm blanket we needed. We piled on some fresh logs, lit 2 candles, and began to examine our treasure. We drew out an overcoat. I made James put it on, and it was the perfect size. I danced around him. Then there was a cloak, and he insisted in seeing me in it. Again, perfect size. My spirits always affected him, and we both laughed like foolish children. There was a warm suit of clothes also, and 3 pairs of woolen hose. There was a dress for me, yards of flannel, a pair of Arctic shoes for each of us. In mine was a slip of paper. I have it now and plan to hand it down to my children. It was Jacob's blessing to Asher that said, "Thy shoes shall be iron and brass, and as the days shall thy strength be." In the gloves, evidently for James, the same dear hand had written, "I, the Lord thy God, will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, Fear not, for I will help thee." It was such a wonderful box, and packed with thoughtful care and love. There was a suit of clothes for each of the boys, all perfectly sized, a little red gown for Ruth. There were mittens and scarves and hoods. Down in the centre of the box was another box. We opened it, and there was a great wax doll. I just burst into tears again. James wept with joy. It was too much. We then both exclaimed again, because close behind it came 2 pairs of skates. There were books for us to read. Some of them I had wished to see, stories for the children to read, aprons and undergarments and knots of ribbon, a beautiful little teddy bear, a lovely photograph, needles, buttons, thread, and an envelope containing a $10 gold piece. We sat and cried over everything we unpacked. It was way past midnight, and we were faint and exhausted even with happiness. I made a cup of tea and cut a fresh loaf of bread, and James boiled some eggs. We drew up the table before the fire, and how we enjoyed our supper that night. Then we sat talking about our life and how sure of a help God had always proven to be. You should have seen the children the next morning. The boys raised a shout at the sight of their skates. Ruth caught up her doll and hugged it so tightly without a word. She went to her room and knelt before her bed and thanked God. When she came back, she whispered to me, "I knew they would be there, Mummy. I just wanted to thank God all the same." We went to the window, and there were boys outside the house straight away, already skating on the ice with all their might. My husband and I tried to return thanks to the church in the east that sent us the box, and we've tried to give thanks to God every day since that amazing Christmas Eve. Hard times have come again and again, but we have trusted him, dreading nothing so much as to doubt his love and his protecting care. Over and over again we have proved that they that seek the Lord shall not want anything. As wonderful as that Christmas Eve was, to see the joy on the children's faces as they enjoyed their gifts, it was on that night that we gained a deeper appreciation of the greatest gift of all, Immanuel, God with us, now and forever. Amen.